Hello, and welcome to History Through Fiction, the podcast. I'm your host, Colin Musful, and today I'm so excited to be joined by Angie Elita Newell, author of the novel All I See Is Violence. Angie, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm really excited about your book. I've already interviewed you once, and I'll be interviewing you again, so I'm so glad that I can help talk about your novel. But before we start talking about the book, I do want to ask you, can you tell me a little bit about your nation, the Lidley Q Nation, First Nation? Uh, Give us a little background of it.
So that's located in Fort Simpson, the Northwest Territories. That's the Boreal Forest, or also known as where Santa Claus lives. So we're going up to the North Pole. I'm part of the Dene linguistic group, and we're considered South Slavey. So we're related to, I think in the States you call them Athabascan. And so we're part, we're like cousins to the Apache and the Navajo.
Okay.
And so
And
we're basket weavers. That's like what we're known for. And so we would traditionally use like birch bark baskets, and then you would use like porcupine quills to make like intricate flower designs. And so that sort of beadwork trickles down throughout all the nations, and you see that incredible beadwork on the plains, hides, and everything.
I was curious to know more about the confluence of the two rivers and what that means for you and your nation, because that's a sacred spot here where I'm from, where the Minneapolis and St. Paul, where the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers come together. It's called Bedote by the Dakota people, and it's a sacred spot. Is there a similar meaning for that confluence where you're from?
For sure, that's sacred. Like that's where the Great Spirit resides. The Great Spirit sort of in anything, right? Like it could be water, earth, rock. Like we understood like that we're all one universal energy.
Well, let's talk about the book then. Tell me about Little Wolf and Nancy Swift Fox. Who are they, and what's the situation in their lives?
Oh, it's a little bit chaotic, isn't it? So, how it got started is I'm trained as a historian, so through like actual academic training. And I was one time at a Musqueam feast. I think we previously sort of talked about this, and an elder mentioned to me that there was female warriors, and I hadn't come across that in my historical work. And when I actually started to seek it, I found that that was true. And so, as I started to research the Battle of Little Bighorn and all the different sort of, there's some big battles that happen in the American West. We have the Comanches, the Nez Perce, we have the Apaches, and then we have the Sioux and the Cheyenne. And it would appear as though at least half were female. So we have Little Wolf, who's, we're kind of at an apocalyptic point in time in American history. We're post Civil War, manifest destiny. They want to conquer what they consider to be wild, right? They consider that land wild. It's not part of the United States yet, and they want to conquer it. And so in order to conquer this wilderness, they have to get rid of the indigenous inhabitants. And so what I found really interesting is when you start going through all our linguistics, like there's no word in any indigenous language for wild. Like it doesn't exist. The closest thing we have is home. So now we have Little Wolf, who kind of gets, caught in the fray because they want to forcibly relocate them to reservations, which, if you're indigenous, yeah. So they're trying to dispossess the Sioux of this land, and they're in doing so, they're breaking a couple of treaties, right? They're breaking the Fort Laramie Treaty, and they're breaking. There's one other one. I can't think of the name. You know what the trouble is with a lot of these treaties is that even when you're researching it, they'll change the name of the treaty like 6 times. It's like the
Yeah,
Fort Laramie Treaty, it's the Black
yeah.
Hills Treaty, and then like Congress renames it something else.
Or yeah, they're just known by several different names. Oh, I'm sure. I mean, it would have broken a line of treaties if you go far enough back in history. So.
Yeah, for sure. So they break like multiple treaties, and this is like only in 1876. And so they're breaking because they want that Black Hills. So the Black Hills, Custer discovers gold. Custer is, the famed lieutenant colonel from the Civil War. He's incredible fighter. He's led very successful pitched battles. And then they assign him to the Indian Wars. And so he kind of goes on a decade reign of terror. Everyone kind of knows, like in that region, who Custer is at this point. He's got his notable curls. He dresses like an indigenous person. We have the Battle of Washita, where they took all the women and children prisoner, and horrible things happen. And he takes, you could say that he takes Montecito for a lover, but I think that would be very kind. And it's rumored that they had a couple of children together. So this is a really, really complicated point in history. So we have little Wolf kind of growing up through this, seeing this. They're displaced. Every time they kind of settle the indigenous groups at this point, they're sort of shuffled. They're pushed by the American military, and so they're constantly moving. Like it's like being a refugee, right, in your own land. And so they don't want to move on to the reservation, because on the reservation you're no longer granted hunting rights for the most part. So you have to become subsistent on the government, and the government allocates them like beef, sugar, coffee, and the rations. It's highly corrupt. So like people are starving to death because the Indian agents in charge of these reservations are reselling these goods to other people. So the Indians aren't actually getting their rations, which was part of the treaty. So again, here we go. We're breaking treaties. So they don't want to go on to these allocated parcels of land, which are incredibly small for the amount of people they're trying to put on there as well. So, we have Sitting Bull, who was a medicine man, and you have Crazy Horse, and you have a number of other chiefs, Gall, who are sort of leading the charge of dissidents. And so they refuse, to comply. They're like, no, like you didn't honor your treaty. So, why should we? So we're just going to keep on, subsisting on, how we know how to subsist, which at this point in time, the buffalo was huge for these people. And so Sheridan and they led a massive genocide against the buffalo. And so you see those pictures where they're just driving the buffalo over the cliff. And so this is to break these nations' backs, right? To make them, because they're taking away their food source. But it doesn't. They're like, well, we're going to find other food. And so everything that they're doing to try to get these people online, it's sort of blowing up in their faces. And they recognize that the Sioux, the Cheyenne, they recognize that they're a very formidable enemy, and they're going strategically towards them. They're not just going willy-nilly, like, let's murder them all. Like it's gaining up to that, where it goes full blown, essentially like extinction, but it's not quite there yet. So there's still some, pieces moving around the board. And then we juxtaposition that with Nancy Swiftbox, who were at kind of the height of the American Indian movement. So this is in the 1970s. And so this is a big point in American history again, because you have, the sort of Black Power movement at the same time, kind of, this is Martin Luther King's just been assassinated. Like this is a huge, we have the Richard Nixon Watergate, we have the Vietnam War. So what fascinated about me, so they end up in the American Indian movement, they have a giant standoff on the Pine Ridge Reservation. Well, here we go. We got the same people that conducted the battle at Little Bighorn. We have the massacre of Wounded Knee, and now we have the Pine River Reservation standoff. Like these people are amazing. This you like that's extraordinary.
You're talking about the Sioux and Lakota.
Mm-hmm. Amazing people, huh?
Well, that raises a lot of questions for me just hearing you talk about the history. You mentioned that you are a trained historian, and I want to talk to you more about that because I write fiction and I came at it from this kind of the same journey, maybe a similar journey as you. I got an MA in history, and then further down the line, I got an MFA in creative writing. And it was kind of for the same reasons, because I write about the US Dakota War that happened here in the state where I live in Minnesota in the US. And I wanted to be able to find a way to bring some of this history to more people. And it's clear hearing you talk that you have a lot of knowledge about the history that happened. You also seem to have a lot of strong feelings. It maybe brings up some pain and trauma and things like that. But why then? And what led you to using all that, putting it together into a novel? And what do you hope to accomplish with that?
I hope to, like, for me, bringing it into a novel, we kind of talked about it before. I'm a mother, And so it's making the history engaging to my children. Like as a historian, like you read amazing documents that are very dry, right? Like the average, reader, if you're not a historian, like there aren't very many historians to begin with. Like you're never gonna, access that information, that knowledge. And then I wanted to bridge the gap between that and oral storytelling. Like I've been told some amazing oral stories by our elders, and that's never even documented, right? That's just sort of passed down, that you just like hear at random, sitting in the kitchen having a cup of coffee, and then all of a sudden you just delve into this alternate version of history. So I wanted to find a medium where I could blend the two together. And I've always loved telling stories. Like that's just like in my blood, and I'm 100% that's from like our indigenous culture. Like that was really encouraged. And when I was 6 years old, when you're asked what you want to be, I'm like, oh, either a princess or a writer. The princess thing didn't work out, so we're going to go with plan B.
Well, there's still time. Well, so when did you first get the idea in your mind that this is a story you wanted to tell?
I just found it all really fascinating. Even like General Custer, like I found really like he's not even a general, and we all, even back then they're referring to him as a general. Like he wasn't that high up in the army. Like that's a lot of charisma, right? To get like everyone to call you like a title that's not yours. It's like better than, it's just really, really interesting. And even, it's like so complicated. Like everyone's like, oh, it's black and white, but no, there's a lot of gray area. Even when I was going through Custer's, I remember we spoke about this previously, Custer's diaries. Like he's talking about, so they're trying to renegotiate these treaties, the Fort Laramie Treaty and that one other one that I can't think of the name, might be Red Cloud, one of them, Red Cloud Agency. Anyways, they had a big problem with what they called squaw. So these were white colonists that married into these nations. And I was explaining this to another person, like we're matrilineal. So we, at this point in time, you would have taken on the woman's name and gone to her, her community. Like that's just like that sort of got dismantled, right? Because the Eurocentric, you know, culture and society is patriarchal. So we,
Mm.
this, you have this like flux of like world views like sort of clashing on the planes. Like to me that was really interesting. So now we're getting into like cultural identity, we're getting into like gender identity, we're getting into, what, like breaking down like, and the problem is that these issues are so prevalent today. Like none of this is fully resolved. Like this is still, this is still affecting everybody, like, indigenous people in particular, but to everybody to some degree.
And do you
And
think,
so,
I'm sorry, go
oh,
ahead.
sorry. Yeah, I was just gonna say that like we're, our ancestors understood this, like we're all one. Like it's, you can't like even the idea of race, like that doesn't come in until the late 1800s with the study of eugenics. So like our ancestors had no concept of what this race was. Like that wasn't even in like their periphery.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that's something you talk about in an article that you wrote that I took some notes on, um, but it was a wonderful article. Where you talked about being one and the concept of race, and trying to work together toward a solution, because yeah, this history, this legacy is still very real and has real consequences for us today. So um, thank you for taking part of the conversation and putting a story out there.
Yeah, and I got news for people. It's not working. When I've experienced some horrific things myself, my family, all for the simple fact that we're indigenous. Like it shouldn't, like that shouldn't be happening in 2023. Like it shouldn't even, like that shouldn't even be like something that the government feels that they have the right to implement. So, I think just by talking about it, like it'll sort of sort itself out, like your energy goes where your conscious flows, sort of thing. Like we're just like, okay, well, what's going on here? Like, how can we elevate this? I think even the most traumatic parts of your life, there's something to benefit from it.
Can you talk more about General Custer, because he's quite a figure. and very controversial. Most now see him as this imperialist, colonialist power that was fighting in the side of genocide. He was very he's seen in a much more negative light nowadays than he was previously. But nevertheless, you had to find a way to portray this man on the page. And I imagine you had some very strong feelings about him before you turned him into the character. What was that like for you to portray him on the page? And did you find yourself maybe humanizing him in a way that you didn't want to, or maybe you feel uncomfortable? What was that like?
Um, I don't really judge anything. Like I'm open to like all experiences. I'm open to all perspectives. And so when I started going through Custer, like you could see that this person was like really egotistical, but he also had a profound respect for the indigenous people. Like he knew that they were very intelligent. He knew that they were fierce warriors. Like he almost fancied himself like a war chief. So when you start sort of I think if you go into it just being neutral and you don't judge things, like I think it gives a more rounded view of who he actually was. So it's, we deal like I think like what was worse for me than the Custer stuff, because when you get into his actual writing and you're like, oh, that's not that bad, is when you started going through like American and Canadian newspapers at that time and what they had to write about us. So it's like, what? Like, so that's like perspective manipulation, where like these dirty savages, ignorant Indian, like that to me, like that was 1,000 times worse than that what was going on with Custard. And even like you get into like Sherman and Sheridan. So these are two generals that are sort of, put in charge of taking care of like the Indian problem. Like even they had a profound respect for the indigenous tribes, as I mentioned earlier. So like, even though they are leading the genocide, like they're sort of just doing their job. And so you kind of see this pattern throughout history. Like you have two sides that are pitched against each other, and you get these epic battles when both sides just really good at doing their job.
I feel like despite what we're talking about here, there is a sense of optimism that you convey in your work and in who you are. Can you talk about that optimism? And also, I think I read this from your article. You want to claim the Thunderbird's power back. What does that mean?
The Thunderbird, we need to reconnect with the Great Spirit. Like it's, people are sort of losing that. It's slipping. Like we need to understand like that's our creatorship. Like we can create any reality we want. Like we don't have to live in this poverty stricken genocidal shrapnel. Like we can raise out of that, and we have to reconnect with that great spirit to get out of there.
You have a bit of a startling title, and I love the cover as well. Can you talk about the cover and the title?
So I worked on the cover with Neil at Greenleaf Press, and I told him I wanted a cover that looked like Jack Sparrow and the American punk band Black Flag collaborated on a wanted poster for like, one of the great chiefs, like for like Sitting Bull or Crazy Horse. And then Neil was just so amazing. Like he just like he understood it. Sometimes I think I'm a pretty abstract person. I can be complicated to understand. Neil just like got it. And so he sent me 5 covers, and like everyone was like, oh no, it's that one. And so that's Sitting Bull's headdress.
Yeah, it's really great. And so he kind of nailed it right away after you asked for that.
Yeah, like straight away. We had like, a series of like 3 emails, and it was just like, boom, he just got it.
Yeah. We were talking a little bit before the interview about the publishing process. This is your debut. So can you talk about what that's been like and how long it's been? Is it a bit surreal? Or what have you learned?
I think it's totally surreal finally seeing like a physical copy. Like even when you're going through it and you're going through the edits and everything, it doesn't seem like it's real until you actually get a book. You're like, whoa, like, it's a book. And as I mentioned to you earlier, like I went into it totally ignorant. Like I thought you just wrote a book and you're like, I published a book, but it's like way more complicated than that. It involves, you end up having to go through like a couple edits and a proofread and then another proofread. And then there's like one more proofread. And like even like Neil had to like typeset all the stuff onto the page. Like that's something I didn't even think about. Like I thought like, that like a program just like did that. Like I had no idea, like, it'd be like making a photocopy of something. You just like put it in a printer and like it pops out a book, but it's not like that at all.
And did you have any input on what the interior looked like?
No. I guess I could have. I was like, yeah, looks great.
Yeah.
He would just send me a file that I would struggle to open, and he'd be like, how does this look? I'm like, amazing.
And now, as we talk today, the book hasn't come out yet. What are you looking forward to with the release, and what kind of plans do you have for it?
I think the thing I'm looking most forward to is sharing my history with everyone. Like, I don't think this should be just limited to Indigenous people. Like, this is all our history. Like, if, you know, Indigenous people not only fought against the government, we also fought alongside the American military, right? We have like a really strong history of military involvement. My mom was in the Royal Canadian Air Force as a pilot. And, I in my novel I write about Nancy's son who was a Vietnam vet, and we weren't conscripted. Like people on the reserve were signing up to go to this war, and same with World War I and World War II. So I mean, it's real gray.
I want to know a little bit more about your craft, and I mentioned this already. Your background as a historian, and then having to learn craft elements of fiction in order to be a storyteller. Um, I also read that you learned a lot from Wilfred Owen, T.S. Eliot, and Ernest Hemingway. So, can you talk about your background in storytelling and how you developed from your early years to where you are now?
Or I think like if you want to be a writer, you have to love to read. And I'll read absolutely anything. And as I mentioned, like I had a pretty chaotic upbringing that's a little bit traumatic. And for me, like I was naturally into storytelling, and reading was like the greatest escape. And what a amazing way to connect to, a people in a history that's not yours, but it's like you're living it. And that sort of modern time. So like, the first half of the 20th century, like that really resonated with me. And those writers that you mentioned, like they were going through a lot of chaos, right? They were going through World War I and World War II. They fought, they were seeing violence at an unprecedented level. And the way that they were able to portray that in their writing is so eloquent. Like it's not aggressive. It's not like, they're not condemning, they're not hating, like they're just sort of observing. And so that's something that I wanted to be able to do as well.
I think that's great. I've got just a couple more things I want to ask you. Um, you write about filling in genocidal gaps in history as historical fiction novelists. We all know about filling in gaps when it comes to marginalized people or women not having their stories heard and not being documented. So, what does that mean for you? You filling in those genocidal gaps, and is it a part of your oral history then that seeps in that way?
Oh, 100%, right? I think the greatest thing we can all do is honor these people who fell. Just to remember them, I think is, you've already taken one step towards healing.
Yeah, definitely. But like what is there certain information that you have to fill in with context, or how much are you able to learn versus how much do you have to just fill in from what you know about what happened here in Minnesota, what happened to the indigenous people populations in South America, what happened throughout people that have been colonized? Do you know what I mean in that sense?
Are you talking about like between like knowing and like archival research?
Well, right, like the research that you know about the events versus the feelings that you're trying to portray and the real genocidal history, behind what those events were.
For sure, because when you read from it from an academic perspective in like a university, like you don't get that sort of heartbreak that it must have been that they went through. Like, you kind of, and it's not just Indigenous history, like you read all history that way. It's just like, oh yeah, 20 million people died in Russia in World War II. Like, next page. Like, it's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Like, let's back this up a little bit. Like, what did that feel like for those people? Like, and by feeling, perhaps it resonates deeper into your subconscious, and maybe we won't repeat those mistakes. Like, if you kind of read from it from such a neutral, unempathetic way, at least that's what I found, that, it just, you're just like, oh, I can just go on with my day. And it's like, well, no, like these are some really traumatic events. And again, like going back to those writers from the early 20th century, like they understood that, like they got that, like their ability to portray that heartbreak made those wars resonate with people on a much grander scale, right? If you mentioned like World War I or World War II, like people have some sort of fiction context for that, whether it's, Schindler's List, Saving Private Ryan, like the film 1917, like that's a more recent one that was amazing. Like, we're indigenous people, we don't really have, our wars aren't sort of portrayed in that light. So I was sort of, taking, going back to like, Hemingway, like Farewell to Arms, like, how could we sort of, write for like a whom the bell tolls?
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's really well said. I think, and that's a great goal.
It's a lofty one.
Yeah. Well, and not to get too deep into it, but earlier in our talk here, you did say, you did kind of say, "Oh, we're not getting very far, people." And we talked a little bit about optimism. So what keeps you going?
No, I believe in humanity. Like, I don't think like, oh, the white people are to blame. Like, I don't think that's the problem at all. Like in Canada, it's the government. Like, without a doubt, it's the Canadian government, and they're still doing some really, really genocidal things now. Like, they're forcibly sterilizing Indigenous women against their will. Like, that's eugenics. And so it's, again, like we're going back to these issues. Like, I believe in humanity. Like, I believe ultimately everyone wants to have, a happy and content life. Like, I don't believe anyone would really wish ill against somebody else.
Mhm.
I'm a glass half full sort of person.
Oh, we need people like that. Tell me about Apparently Transparent, your podcast.
Yeah, we haven't gotten that quite up and going yet because it's been a little bit crazy in my house, but it is going to get going in the new year. And, I want to kind of get into like all issues. Like, for me, something that struck me really interesting when I was doing archival research for this novel. So, as a historian, and you're kind of asking about like my process, like I research until I'm like blue in the face, till like I have other writers telling me to stop researching. They're like, you just need to write. You're like, we can't like, I'll have like stacks and stacks of documents and stuff that I've written and books. Like I probably own close to 1,000 books. I remember we were talking when you were in your office, I think, and you have like just as many books as me. Like,
Hmm.
I just love all that sort of information. But one of the I don't know if we talked about it, but I did talk about it on the Drunken Pen. Almost all our creation stories seem to be like alien in origin. And then there's Artie Six Killer Clark, who was a professor at Montana State University, and she compiled like a huge amount of documentation of like, these aliens. And where I'm from, it's, we call it Umaria, and we were like star seeded here from the Little Dipper. And so, these stories are sort of, fantastic, like the Thunderbird, and people just like, because they're not ready to hear that sort of version of it, they're like, no, that's not true. And they just like shut it to the back of their mind. But to me, like that opened up like a whole nother like level to like the spirituality and like where all these different stories come from. And so like just it's just like for me it's been so fascinating. So like the academic research led to like the oral stories, which led to like a whole different layer to the history, and then kind of like melding that together. So on the podcast I want to go into sort of those more abstract layers to history that have sort of been not documented.
Mm. That sounds very interesting, and we'll look forward to hearing it. What
Yeah.
are you working on, a new novel?
I'm working currently on Geronimo. So if you think this one's violent, Geronimo is incredibly interesting. And he worked in connection with the medicine woman Lozin. And so Lozin, the same way that these female warriors were sort of, eradicated from history, so is Lozin. Like it's hard to find any information on her. I managed to find several like firsthand interviews that were documented with her, but she's very beautiful too. There was a couple of photos of her and you're like, whoa, like that was a good looking woman. So she ends up dying of tuberculosis when they forcibly relocated them to Florida. And so the people that lived through the Battle of Little Bighorn, the American military men who lived through that, kind of get reassigned to the American Southwest, down where the Apaches are. And Geronimo just leads them on a chase for like 20 years. And it kind of goes into the fantastic as well, because here we have a man who could apparently, summon the thunder. And then you have Lozin, who's clearly remote viewing. And so they're able to, kind of get around getting captured.
Well, that sounds like a great story, and I'm glad that you're going to tell it.
Yeah, I feel like Geronimo is kind of like Custer, like he like really like provokes like something in people that's not necessarily positive.
Yeah, I mean it's people who have kind of worked their way into just the pop culture. You forget the roots of who they actually were and what they stood for, and yeah, so I think it's important to rediscover them through historians and authors like you.
Yeah, well, his wife, his three kids, and his mother were all slaughtered while they were sleeping. And so he comes back to find them dead in the teepee, and he just like mentally unhinges. Like this is like, and it's just like heartbreaking. Like he talks about like, screaming and crying for like days on end. And then he goes on like, this homicidal rampage that lasts like a decade.
I'll be interested to see how you handle that.
I'm interested to see how I handle that. I'll have to channel my inner Wilfred Owen.
Well, Angie, congratulations on your novel, All I See Is Violence, and thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.